In this part of the tutorial we'll be adding in some lighting. So first thing I'm going to do is just scrub through the power slider until we reach a point in time where we can see our text and the globe reasonably well. Let's just switch off the Extrude NURBS News Today while we work on the initial lighting, and we can come back to that shortly. So if we come up to the pop-up menu here with all the icons, you can see we have the option to add in a few different types of lights. Let's just choose light for now. Pull this up so we can see our attributes manager. So in the first general tab we can see we can set the color of the light, the intensity, the type, shadows, visible light, and then we have a group of checkboxes at the bottom here for some other parameters that are available. Now an omni light is a point light, so basically the light is emitted from one point in space into all directions. If we click here we also have the option to choose spotlight. If we have a look at this from above, we can see our light, and we can see that we have a cone now for the spotlight, and this is the area of illumination. We also have an infinite light, and an infinite light is basically a kind of parallel light. So it doesn't really matter where you position it, it's more just the direction of it, and that would be used for things like sunlight and stuff like that. And the last option that we're going to look at is the area light, and the area light is the one we're going to use, and the area light is basically a kind of grid of omnis, and it creates a bank of light, and rather than you getting such a specific kind of light from one point, it's spread over a larger area. And as we can see in our view, although we can't see it here because the globe is so black, if we come to kind of the side and the front view, you can see here's our area light here, and we have a kind of square that represents the area that it makes up. We can drag to change the width and height of that. So if we switch to the details tab, you can see that we have a general outer size radius, and then we have down here size X and Y, so we can create light that is sort of long and thin in either aspect ratios. As well as being able to adjust the actual outer radius and the X and Y size to adjust the aspect ratio, we can also change the type of shape that it is. So we can choose in here disc, or we could choose line, and we also have some three-dimensional shapes such as sphere, cylinder, cube and hemisphere. And then the final option in here, object spline, this allows you to actually drag some polygon object or a spline object into this field, and it will then use that as the area light. So imagine if it was a spline, it would essentially virtually kind of distribute lights along that spline. You can then use that for some particularly cool lighting effects. In this example I'm going to leave it as rectangle. I'm using an area light in this example because I prefer the kind of wide diffuse lighting that it gives off. Obviously a spotlight lights up an area in a specific place that you target with the cone, and that certainly has its uses, but for this example I want the light to be pretty even over the word and the globe, etc. So if we switch to F5 so we can see all our views, we can now see that we have our area light, and it's kind of at world center, apart from the fact that I've moved it up on Y slightly. If I just drag and pull it back, you can see it starts to light up the scene in our perspective view. If we render the view, we can see the result of the light, and we can see exactly what's going on. An alternative is to press Alt R. This brings up the interactive render region, which we can resize, and we can also, if we grab the edge, we can position this where we like, and this, as you can see, gives us a kind of low resolution preview. We can grab this slider at the side here, and this will decrease or increase the quality of our preview. And very often if you're working with lights and you're moving them around, this is a quick way to get feedback. Okay, we can right click and we can come into here and we can have a look at the settings for our interactive render region, so we can adjust certain parameters. You can also save the interactive render region result, and then just press Alt R to remove. So one of the difficulties with lighting is positioning the light, and the other thing in relation to that is actually positioning the direction of the light. With a certain type of light, such as an omni light, the direction of it doesn't matter at all, but with other lights, such as a spotlight, the direction of it makes a huge difference. If it's not pointing at the subject that you wish to be lit, then it won't be lit. With an area light, it will emit light both Z forward and Z negative, but it's still pretty helpful to actually point the light at the direction that you want it to. One of the ways that we can facilitate that is by using what's called a target tag, and what we can do is we can add that to our light, and then we can then say we'd like it to always target a certain object. So I'm going to just take the light, choose tags, Cinema 4D tags, target tag, and as you can see we now have a couple of fields for a target object and an up vector. So let's add in a null and let's call this globe light target. If we select the target tag, we can then drag this object into the target, and if you watch the light in the editor view, you can see it immediately tilted towards this object. If we move this object around, you can see that the light follows it at all times. So target tag certainly has its uses other than for lighting, but they're pretty useful for that too. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press F5 so I can see all my views. And the area that I want to be lit, that most important, is kind of towards the front where the text and stuff is. So I'm just going to drag the globe light target so it sits in that position. I'm just going to zoom out some more. And I'm going to kind of use all of my views to position my lights. Now I can see the point that it's targeting. It's just a matter of changing the position of the light itself. And this is going to be my key light, so my main light. So I'm just going to call this globe key light. Let's come to the general tab, and here I'm going to make the light kind of slightly warmer, only very, very slightly. I don't really want it changing the colour of the objects too much, but I'd like it to just have a slightly warm feel to it. Now if I drag in the top view, I can position this somewhere around here, and let's just move it up slightly so it's kind of pointing down towards the subject. So if we come to our perspective view and render and see the result of that, okay, so you can see the lights hitting the sphere on this side, and down here is kind of slightly dark, not very well illuminated. As you can see, we're getting some pretty hot spots as well from the specular highlight. This is from our anisotropic highlight, and it's where the light is hitting that particular letter most directly. So the thing that we can do is we can actually set the light up to not produce any specular at all, and then we could add another light later to control exactly where we'd like that to hit. So that's the method that I'm going to use. So to do that, we come to the general tab in our light, and down here we have a checkbox for diffuse and specular. So if we uncheck specular for this light, if we now hit render, you can see that we don't get that specular highlight anymore. It is looking a little bit dull. Especially around here, it's quite dark, and it's very rare that you'll ever get away with lighting a scene with just one light. It's a good idea to add in what's called fill lights, and you use those at slightly lesser intensity to fill in the areas that the key light isn't hitting. Now, as we're going to add another light, what we could do is we could just control drag our globe key light, and let's rename this globe fill light. And as it's a fill light, I'm going to adjust the colours and make it slightly colder. So let's come to our blues and let's just give it a colour that's very slightly blue. And as you can see here, it is only just off-white. If we render now, we're getting a real hot spot. The light intensity is far, far too high. But this is just because both lights are currently in the same position and they're both pointing at exactly the same place. So the idea of the fill light is to fill in the areas of the object or scene that aren't illuminated properly by the key light, just to get a nice balance of light. Now the kind of key to fill ratio really depends on the look that you're after. You may want both lights to be a very similar intensity, so the lighting is kind of quite flat and uniform, or you could have your key light very bright and the intensity of the fill light much lower, which would result in much more contrasty, more dramatic lighting. It really depends on the look that you're actually after. There's no reason at all that you can't have more than one fill light and use several lights to kind of get rid of any very dark areas. For this example here, I'm going to take my fill light and let's just move it around so it's hitting this side of the globe a little bit more. Not quite so far, probably around there, so it's still kind of pointing at the front. And if we come to one of our side views, we can then pull this down just so that we can see that it's now kind of going to be illuminating more of this part of the sphere. We still have a little bit of a dark spot under here. Sorry, I just clicked to select the globe then. But if we hit render, you can see that we're getting a much more even and uniform lighting. If we just disable that fill light and render, and then let's enable this and render. Okay, so you can see we're getting a much better result already. As I duplicated the light, my fill light also has specular off, and the thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to reduce the intensity of the fill down to around 70. I'm going to select my key light and I'm also just going to reduce the intensity of that down to 90, and let's just have a look and see how that looks now. Okay, that's not looking too bad. The text is looking a little bit grey, so perhaps I should leave that at 100 for now. Yeah, that's a bit better. Once we've added our specular to it, it should look a lot more interesting. When you're working on lighting a scene, it's a good idea sometimes to isolate each light to see the effect that it's having. Now you can do that by adding them to layers and soloing the layers, or you can just switch the green tick to a red cross to disable the light temporarily. So if we switch off our key light and let's render, and we can see the result that our fill light is giving us. So we can see more clearly the area that that's illuminating. And if we switch the key on and switch the fill off, then we can see which part that's illuminating. And then when you switch them on and you get the combination, you can see how they're working together. So we could always add another fill light down pointing under here just to light this bit so that it's even more evenly lit. But I kind of like the contrast that we have right now. One of the common lighting setups that you'll come across in 3D is what's called 3-point lighting. And normally the way a 3-point lighting is set up is you have a key light, a fill light, and then you'll also have what's called a rim light or a backlight. And what that is you take another light and you add it behind your object, and this very often can bring it forward and make it kind of stand out slightly more in the scene. So what we can do is we can take our light and let's just put it up here and behind. So we need to pull it up like so. So it's just hitting the top and the back of the objects. If we just switch off the other lights and come to our perspective view and hit render, let's see the effect that that's having. Okay, so it's not having too much effect at the moment, but you can see it's sort of hitting the top of the letters. So let's just move this forward more. Obviously this depends on the object of your scene. There we go, you can see it's kind of hitting the top of the globe more now. We could even take this even further forward like so. Okay, so this just adds a slight more dimension and depth to the lighting that is set up. If we switch all our lights on now and hit render, okay, you can see that it's not looking too bad. It's quite even with a little bit of contrast, and hopefully that will give you some ideas of how to start off lighting some of your objects. If you don't use fill lights, you will end up with kind of quite a few darker areas where you lose a lot of detail. Adding in fill can certainly make for some very interesting lighting effects. And also adjusting the colour temperature of your lights makes a big difference. In this example we've used a kind of warm light for our key light, and then you can see that there is this very, very slight yellow tint to the front of our letters. But where we've used our backlight and fill light, I've actually put a typo there, we've used a much colder, bluer light, and you can see that in the render because the edges and the sides of our letters have a more of a slightly blue tinge to them. And this is kind of reflects nature. Things that are in bright light tend to look warmer, and things that are in shadow tend to look slightly cooler. As we've disabled the specular option on these three lights, we're not going to have any specular highlights. Now our text is quite drab of the material without the reflection and without the specular, so there's a couple of things that we can do to make this look more interesting. And the first thing we can do is to add in a light that controls just the specular highlights. Now you may or may not want to do this in other scenes, it really depends on each specific scene, but you probably will want to disable your specular on several of your lights, otherwise a lot of objects with lots of specular highlights will just look unnatural, so you probably only have one or maybe two lights that will be adding specular highlight. So in this example I'm going to just take my key light and control drag, and let's call this globe specular light. I'm going to set the colour to be pure white, switch off the diffuse and switch on specular. If we come to the coordinates, let's zero out all the settings for now, and also let's take our target tag and delete this. I'm going to hold Alt down and add a null, and I'm going to call this specular null. And the reason for that is so that I can drag my light out and then use the null so that the light can orbit around the sphere. So let's give our specular light a Z value of say minus 1000. Okay, so as you can see it's sticking out here. So it's round the wrong side at the moment. I think I'm actually going to take it back a little bit more. Let's set this to say minus 1200. If we select the specular null, you can see the heading is set to 180, so that's why it's round the wrong side. If we zero that now, there's our specular light here in the right place. And if we animate this heading value, you can see that our specular light will then move around the globe in an orbiting fashion. Let's undo that, switch to our perspective view. Okay, and you can see that it's going to kind of move backwards and forwards, and it will project a specular highlight across the surface of these letters. Okay, so let's set that back to 0 and let's go about setting these parameters more accurately. I'm going to just come to my timeline so I can position the point in time that I want the highlight to move across the letters. So I'd like the letters to be, or the words to be fully formed. I reckon somewhere around frame 30. And let's set this to 60 for now. I'm going to press F5 so I can see all views. So I can see my specular light is over here. If I render in my main view, you can just see that we're getting a slight hit on the side of the letter there. So on frame 30, let's add a key for the heading of our specular null. And let's jump forward to say 45. And let's set this to be minus 60. And add another key. So if we come to the middle of that point in time and then render our perspective view, okay, you can see that we've got some lighting here. So let's jump forward a few frames. And there you go, and you can see it's moving across. Like so. By the way, I'm using G to sort of move forward, and you can use F to move back frame by frame. It just nudges things forwards and backwards. So you could do a test render now to see what that looks like, but I'm pretty confident that the specular highlight is going to kind of travel across the letters as the light sweeps around. If we get to this point here, let's just render, and you can see that it's no longer actually affecting the letters. And I'd like it to do the same thing on the second set of words, which is going to be somewhere around here. So let's go to frame 75 and let's set this back to 60. Add a key, and let's jump forward to frame 90 and set this to be minus 60. So again, our specular light has come to the top view, and we can see as we drag through, you can see it moving around. The only problem now is that between those points in time, our specular light is going to be moving back across the objects. So if we just fold this down so we can see the rotation parameters, you can see here that we have our little F curve, and we have between this key and this key it's travelling back between minus 60 and 60. So we really want to set this as, in After Effects, to be called a hold keyframe, or it has step interpolation. So if we select that key and choose key step, you can see that it doesn't actually do any position movement or rotation, throughout that period of time. It doesn't change value until it reaches the next key. And if we watch from above, you can see that our specular light here stays still, and then as we scrub through at that point in time, it jumps back and moves around again. So we should just get a nice highlight travelling across our letters as they have formed. We have the highlight, and then it wipes to the next set of letters, and then we get the highlight sweeping across again. Okay, cool, so it's a good time to save. And the next thing we can look at is how we can isolate this lighting, because if we come to the end of our comp and enable the Extrude News Today object, let's render now, you can see that the lighting, although it is hitting the side of the words here, it's not lighting that very well. So how can we cope with that? We could actually take our lights and pull them back in the scene so that they're much further back and everything is more evenly lit. Or the other option we have is to say that I'd like these lights here to only light the globe, and then add in some alternative lights to light the actual words. And that's the method I'm going to use. And what we do for that is we use what's called include and exclude lists. Before we do that, let's switch to our layer browser and select these items that we've just added in. If we control drag this onto our lights cameras layer, that will add all those parts to that layer. So now we can hide them if we need to. Okay, cool stuff. So if we select the globe light, let's unfold this and also press Control and select the globe specular light in our attributes manager. If we switch to the scene tab, you can see that we have an option here to include or exclude objects. And what this means is that if we add any in at the moment, they will be excluded from this light. So we want to switch that to include. You can see by doing that the scene immediately turns black if we render. All you can see are kind of your reflections. The reason for that is because we haven't dragged any objects in, so there are no objects to be included on that light. So what we need to do is we need to find the objects that we want to add and just drag them into that list. So as we scroll down through the object manager, we can see the objects that we'd like to include with those lights, which includes our fracture objects and the sphere to clone onto, etc, etc. So let's click on the first one and then shift click. And you can see what happens is the attribute manager no longer has our include exclude list included. So what can we do? Let's reselect our lights. Now we have our include list. So we could take each item and drag them in one by one. That's certainly an option. Let's just remove those for a moment. Another alternative would just be to lock our attribute manager. If we lock it, then we can select other objects and this won't update. So we can then select all our objects. And let's just shift click from the top to the bottom and let's drag those in. And you can see that the attribute manager doesn't update because it's locked. It stays on the light settings. We can now unlock it and you can see that it switches over to the multiple selected objects. If we come back to our lights and just have a look at this include list, you can see that we have the name of the object and the icon for the object, and then we also have these other small icons. So what this means is that we can not only include or exclude specific objects, but we can include or exclude specific objects from certain light parameters. And hopefully the little icons themselves make it quite clear. But what they refer to are the diffuse, the specular, the shadow, and then this little icon here means hierarchy. So we want to leave the hierarchy enabled so that, for instance, our null sphere has a hierarchy with the sphere to clone onto and then the cloner as well. We'd like all of those objects to be included, so that's why we leave the hierarchy enabled. We don't have any shadowing on our lights, but we would like the specular and the diffuse to be included onto all objects. But using this list is a good way to say I only want this object to have specular from this light and no diffuse, for instance. So include exclude lists are very useful, and we will be using them again so that we can add some more lights for news today. Because if we render now, you can see that although we can see the news today from our reflection, none of the lights are actually affecting it. So the include list has worked perfectly well, and it's only included our globe and our fracture objects. If we just scrub back and render at this point, we can see that it's definitely including our fracture objects. There we go. Cool stuff. So let's just move to the end here and let's add in some basic lighting for news today. To do this, I'm going to take the key light that I've already created, just control drag this to the top for now, and let's call this text key light. In the scene tab, in the include list, let's select all the objects in there and hit delete to delete those for now. Take our extrude objects and let's drag this in. And you can see that immediately the news today extrude NURBS gets some diffuse lighting. If we switch to our top view and just zoom out slightly, the first problem that we'll have is that our text key light has a target tag which is targeting this null that is over here. So let's keep it relatively simple and let's just drag the extrude news today object as the target. If we select the extrude news today, you can see this is where the axis is, and when we select our light we can see that the z-axis of the light points directly at that position. Okay. As we're using an area light, we can get away with taking this back here, and the light will be pretty much covering the whole of our text, and we should get a reasonably nice diffuse kind of lighting effect. Let's just switch to a side view, and let's just drag this up slightly so it hits the top of the letters as well. And we need to do the same for a fill light, so let's take our globe fill light, control drag this to the top, and let's just rename this text. Come to the target tag, let's drag in the extrude news today. Let's also come to our light, and as we have the include list, we need to delete these items out and drag our extrude news today object into that list. Switch to the top view and you can see that it's in totally the wrong place, but if we just pull it back here, you can kind of tell that this light's going to hit the side of all of these letters. And if we come to the side view and just take it down very slightly, it will add a small amount of light to the bottom of the letters, and they're areas that aren't being illuminated by the main text key light. So if we render now, you can see that that's lit pretty evenly and everything looks cool. Okay, so this time we still don't have a specular for our news today, and we could do a very similar thing, and we could animate specular light running across the surface of that over these last few frames at the end here. Before we do that, however, I think that we should animate this text coming on, because it would probably be nice if the text kind of animated on, and then as that kind of transitions across from one side to the other, then we have the specular light mirroring that effect. So let's add in the animation on our news today object, and then we can add in the specular light to finalize this part of the tutorial. I'm going to use MoGraph and have a similar effect where each letter scales up and twists into place, just so that it reflects the animation that we used earlier on. So because it's an extrude object, we're going to need to use a fracture object. So let's select it, hold Alt down and add in a fracture object. We can then just rename this news today. We can also switch to our layer browser and let's add the fracture object to our MoGraph text layer. If we come back to the editor view and hit render, you can see that now the lighting no longer works. Now the reason for this is because we're using include and exclude lists, and we included our extrude news today. And you may be thinking, well, why isn't the extrude object being lit? Because it's in the include list for our key and for our fill light. The reason for this is because the fracture object is actually a generator. So what it's doing is it's taking the extrude object and it's converting it into a MoGraph ready fracture object, and then it's actually displaying it for us. So we're not actually seeing the extrude NURBS. That doesn't actually exist anymore. It's been regenerated into this new fracture object. So what we need to do is delete the extrude news today from the include list and drag the fracture object into that list. And there you go, immediately you can see that now our lights are working again. So that's something to bear in mind if you're doing include exclude lists. Certain objects that are generators, such as fracture object, cloner, things like that, you need to actually include the generator, not the child of it. So now we've got that working, let's add in a plane effector. It's the simplest effector to use for this. If you're not using the release that the plane effector was included in, then you can use the shader effector with no shader in it. It will achieve the same result. As we had the fracture object selected, our plane effector is added in. Let's just rename this plane effector news scale. And if we come to the parameter here, deselect position, enable scale, uniform scale, -1. Our text disappears. Let's also enable rotation and set the heading to 180. So at the moment we know that our fall off will be set to infinite, and for this we're going to use linear. If we come to our coordinates tab and just set our heading to 90, and now if we grab this we should be able to drag it through. Okay, and you see that at that point the whole of news today is spinning on and scaling up. So that's not quite the result that we're after, but at least we can see that our plane effector is working on that object. The reason it's like that is because the fracture object is still on its default settings. So if we come to the object tab on our fracture object, you can see that the mode is set to straight. And if you remember from earlier in the tutorial, we set this to explode segments and connect. And now you can immediately see the result looks more satisfactory. Sorry, just moved the wrong object there. Let's grab the plane effector and let's pull this through. and you can see that as I do that, each letter spins into place and scales up. There we go, you can see it if I move it more slowly. Okay, so it's a bit one letter at a time at the moment. I'd like the transition to be spread out over the whole word if possible, and we can do that by adjusting the length of our fall off. So you can either drag this in the editor, or I'm going to choose to change it numerically in the attribute manager, and now you can see we've got a much longer fall off, and as you drag through, the letters kind of flip and scale up. Cool stuff. Okay, so now it's just a matter of adding some keys for this, and then we should be able to set up our specular light. Just going to switch to the layer browser and add my plane effector to the effectors layer. You can see that it's immediately disappeared. The reason for that is because we have our effectors all hidden in manager, so I want to see that for now. Also, what I'm going to do is drag this just so it's at the bottom of the list, just to keep my object manager reasonably well organized. So with the plane effector selected, switch to your attributes, to your coordinates, and let's set the X to be somewhere around 4,000. Okay, minus 4,000. I think I'm being a bit enthusiastic there with my values. Let's switch to the front view, and you can see that I've moved it miles over there. I think I want that to be something more like 400. Okay, that looks cool. Let's just drag it so that we can see when the letters actually start appearing. So they don't start appearing until around there, so we could almost get away with that being actually more like 400 rather than minus 400. And at what point do we want that to start moving across? Well, pretty much as soon as the globe kind of lands in place. So let's just start it a few frames before, add a key here. And how long would we like that to take for that transition? All this is pretty speculative, but I would say we want it to happen pretty quick, something around 10-15 frames. So let's try 115, so we've moved 10 frames. And now if we grab this, we can drag it across. Let's keep going. Okay, let's make sure it's well clear. There we go, somewhere around there. So let's add another key here. So now as we drag across, you can see that News Today wipes on. Cool stuff. I'm just going to save again and then move on. If we have a look in our timeline, here we have the plane effector news scale that we just created. Let's press Control and have a look at the F-curve for this. And we can say frame selected. At the moment it's got a little ease in and an ease out. We don't need it to be like that, so let's just make that linear. There's no reason to ease in and ease out the motion of our effector moving through. We just want it running straight through like so. Okay, cool stuff. Now that's set up, we can come to the plane effector news scale object. Let's switch the fall off tab and just uncheck visible so that when we deselect the object we can't see it in the editor view, just to keep it uncluttered. And now let's take our specular globe light, control drag to create a new light, and let's call this text specular light. If we switch to the scene tab on this light, we can take all the objects out of the include list and just drag our fraction News Today object into that list. Switch to the coordinates tab and let's set the X to be 0 and the heading to be 0. So there's our light. If we switch to the top view, we can see that it won't be hitting the fraction News Today. Let's just set this to say minus 1000, so it's a bit further back. And the next thing to do is just to animate this travelling across. So the wipe finishes at 115. Let's go to 120, just so we've got a few frames in between. I'm just going to frame project settings. I'm going to add a key for the Z position of this light, and this time I think I'm going to give it 15 frames. And now if we drag this across, we can animate our light moving. I've added a key for the wrong parameter, silly me. Let's just click on here, delete track, choose the X parameter. There we go. we're moving it on X, we have the actual little gizmo in the corner here that shows me, so that was a silly mistake. And you'll notice that I've actually added the key at the wrong frame as well there, but we can just select the key and let's set that to 120 and that moves it back. Now we can drag the light across. At least one of us is concentrating here. Okay, so that probably looks around right. So if we just select the light and let's just add another key for our X value. Cool stuff. If we switch to F-curve, we can see again that it is naturally easing, and we can just switch that to linear, just so that our light travels across in a nice straight line without any slowing down or speeding up. If we switch to the front camera view, okay, I can see a problem has occurred here. I'm not sure if you can see that, but you can see that we're getting some odd rounding and stuff on our fracture object. And if you remember, we had the same problem with our fracture objects earlier, and this is because of the thong tag. If we take the thong tag and move that onto our fracture object, then everything should be okay. I'm going to move the material there too. We don't necessarily need to do that, but we can just see that when the hierarchy is folded. There we go, that looks better. Okay, cool. So as we move through, you can see that the highlight travels across the text. Okay, well that all seems to be working as it should, apart from a couple of little mistakes by me then. Apologies for that. Easily fixed. Cool stuff. So we've got some pretty basic lighting going on. Obviously you can spend a little bit more time and get this looking even more interesting, but hopefully that will give you a starting point on how to use lights for diffuse only, to create a specular only light, and then to use include exclude lists so that you can light specific objects in your scene and exclude others. So I'm going to save the project at this point and move on to the next part of the tutorial. So in the next part of the tutorial we will be using the tracer object, which is part of MoGraph, and we'll be using that to add in some kind of streaky glows and lines. We'll be tracing the matrix object, and we'll also be tracing some nulls. And once we've created those objects, we shall create a few new materials to go with it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this part, and let's move on.